when darkness falls and the wind howls through the mountains of Romania. Locals still whisper tales of a man whose cruelty was so absolute that death itself became his greatest weapon. They speak of a prince who turned warfare into an art form of terror, who wielded psychological brutality like a master craftsman wields his finest tool. But these are not mere legends born from campfire stories or Hollywood fantasies. These are the blood-soaked chronicles of Vlad III, the real man who inspired the legend of Dracula, and whose most horrifying battle would forever change the meaning of fear itself. Picture this. The year is 1462, and the most powerful empire on earth has decided to crush a single man. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, the destroyer of the Byzantine Empire, has assembled an army of 90,000 soldiers. Think about that number for a moment. 90,000 hardened warriors, janissaries trained from birth to kill, cavalry units that had trampled entire nations into dust, siege engines that had toppled the walls of empires. All of this overwhelming force marching toward one small principality in the mountains of Wallachia. Standing against this tsunami of steel and flesh was a man with barely 30,000 peasant militia, armed with nothing more than spears and hunting bows. By every measure of military logic, this should have been a massacre. The Ottoman war machine had conquered from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Black Sea. They had turned entire kingdoms into footnotes in history books. Yet on that summer night in 1462, something happened that would haunt the Sultan's dreams for the rest of his life. But before we witness the carnage that would make even hardened soldiers weep with terror, we need to understand the mind of the man who orchestrated it. Vlad Tepes was not born a monster. He was forged into one by the very empire he would later defy. As a boy, he had been held hostage in the Ottoman court, where he learned to speak Turkish without accent, studied their military tactics, and watched as his captors demonstrated the ruthless efficiency that had built their empire. Little did they know they were creating their own nightmare. When Vlad finally returned to claim his throne in Wallachia, he brought with him a deep understanding of Ottoman psychology and an even deeper hatred for everything they represented. The Turks had taught him that fear could be more powerful than any army, that the right kind of terror could break the will of entire populations. He had learned their lessons well, perhaps too well. The confrontation began when Vlad refused to pay the jizya, the tax imposed on non-Muslims under Ottoman rule. This was not merely an act of defiance. It was a declaration of war against the most powerful military force in the known world. Sultan Mehmed, fresh from his conquest of Constantinople, could not allow such insubordination to go unpunished. The message had to be clear. Defy the Ottoman Empire and face complete annihilation. But Vlad had already begun his own campaign of terror. In the winter of 1462, he had crossed the frozen Danube and launched a series of raids into Bulgarian territory that would shock even his contemporaries who were accustomed to medieval brutality. Over the course of 2 weeks, his forces covered 800 kilometers, systematically slaughtering over 23,000 Turkish civilians and soldiers. This was not warfare as it was traditionally understood. This was ethnic cleansing conducted with surgical precision. In his own words, written in a letter to the Hungarian king, Vlad described his methodology with chilling matter-of-factness. He had killed peasants, men and women, old and young, from villages along the Danube to settlements deep in Bulgarian territory. But he did not simply kill them. He impaled them. 25,000 human beings slowly tortured to death on sharpened stakes, their bodies left as monuments to his wrath. The method of impalement that earned Vlad his terrible epithet was designed not just to kill, but to maximize suffering. A long, thick, sharpened pole was inserted into the victim's body and then planted upright in the ground. The stake was deliberately rounded at the tip to prevent quick death. Over hours, sometimes days, gravity would slowly pull the victim down the pole until it pierced through their torso, sometimes emerging through the throat or mouth. In an age of gruesome executions, this was considered the most horrific way to die. When news of these atrocities reached Constantinople, Sultan Mehmed knew he had to respond with overwhelming force. The army he assembled was nearly as large as the one he had used to conquer the Byzantine capital 8 years earlier. This was not merely a punitive expedition. This was meant to be the complete eradication of Vlad and everything he represented. But as the massive Ottoman force crossed the Danube in June of 1462, they encountered something they had not expected. The countryside was empty. Villages stood abandoned. Wells had been poisoned. Fields had been salted. Rivers had been diverted to create impassable swamps. Vlad had implemented a scorched earth policy so complete that even his own territory became uninhabitable. The psychological impact on the Ottoman army was immediate and devastating. These were soldiers who had conquered half the known world, yet they found themselves struggling to find basic necessities like food and water. When foraging parties ventured too far from the main force, they simply disappeared. Bodies would be found days later, impaled on stakes as warnings to others. Worse still, Vlad began using biological warfare tactics that were centuries ahead of their time. He sent diseased individuals into the Ottoman camps, deliberately spreading bubonic plague and leprosy among the enemy ranks. The mighty army that had crossed the Danube in perfect formation was slowly being consumed by hunger, disease, and an ever-present terror that death could come from any direction at any moment. As the weakened Ottoman force finally approached the Wallachian capital of Târgovişte, Sultan Mehmed must have believed that the worst was behind him. His army was still vastly superior in numbers, and once they reached the fortified city, they could finally bring their overwhelming advantage in siege warfare to bear. The walls would fall, Vlad would be captured, and the rebellion would be crushed. But Vlad had one final lesson to teach about the true nature of fear. On the night of June 17th, as the Ottoman army made camp outside Târgovişte, a lone figure approached the sentries at the main gate. He was dressed in Ottoman military garb and spoke perfect Turkish without any trace of accent. The guards, exhausted from weeks of marching through hostile territory, allowed him to pass without question. What they did not know was that they had just admitted Vlad himself into the heart of their army. Using the language and customs he had learned during his years as a hostage, he walked freely through the camp, memorizing the location of key commanders' tents, studying the layout of defenses, and identifying the exact position of the Sultan's own pavilion. When he had gathered all the intelligence he needed, he simply walked back out the way he had come. The stage was now set for a night that would become legend, a battle that would demonstrate once and for all that, in the hands of a true master, terror could indeed defeat even the mightiest army ever assembled. 3 hours after sunset, hell came to earth. Vlad returned to that same gate, but this time he was not alone. Behind him rode 7,000 of his most loyal warriors, their horses' hooves wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. The same guards who had unknowingly admitted him hours earlier now faced a column of death emerging from the darkness. By the time they understood what was happening, it was far too late. The night erupted into chaos. Wallachian cavalry thundered through the Ottoman camp like a plague of locusts, their torches turning the darkness into a hellscape of dancing shadows and screaming men. Bugles blared from every direction, creating the illusion of an army 10 times larger than it actually was. In the confusion, Ottoman soldiers struck down their own comrades, unable to distinguish friend from foe in the flickering light. Vlad himself led the charge toward the Sultan's tent, cutting down anyone who stood in his path. For a few terrifying minutes, it seemed as though he might actually succeed in killing Mehmed II, the most powerful ruler on earth, in his own camp surrounded by 90,000 soldiers. But in the maze of identical pavilions, his forces struck the wrong targets. Instead of the Sultan, they found the tents of his viziers, Mahmud Pasha and Isaac, slaughtering the Ottoman command structure but missing their ultimate prize. As dawn approached and the advantage of surprise faded, Vlad made the tactical decision that would define his legacy. Rather than press the attack and risk annihilation in daylight, he ordered his forces to withdraw. But this was no retreat. This was the opening movement of a symphony of terror that would crescendo into something the world had never seen before. The Ottoman army awoke to a nightmare. Thousands of their comrades lay dead or dying. Their command structure was in ruins. Disease continued to spread through their ranks like wildfire. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the realization that they had been outmaneuvered by a force less than 1/10 their size. The psychological impact was devastating. These were men who had conquered Constantinople, who had brought the Byzantine Empire to its knees, yet they had been made to look like amateurs by a single Wallachian prince. Sultan Mehmed, his pride wounded and his authority challenged, pressed forward toward Târgovişte. He would take the city, capture Vlad, and restore Ottoman prestige through a display of overwhelming force. The Sultan's engineers prepared their siege equipment while his soldiers formed ranks for what they believed would be the final assault. Victory was within reach, but as they crested the final hill before the capital, the advancing army stopped dead in their tracks. What they saw defied comprehension, challenged the very limits of human imagination, and forever changed how warfare would be understood. Spread across the landscape before them was a forest unlike any that had ever existed on Earth. 20,000 sharpened stakes rose from the ground like the twisted branches of some demonic tree. Upon each stake was impaled a human body in various stages of decomposition. Men, women, children, soldiers, civilians, all had been subjected to Vlad's signature form of execution. The tallest stake, positioned prominently at the center of this macabre display, held the body of Hamza Pasha, the very Ottoman official who had been sent to demand tribute from Vlad the year before. But the true horror lay in the details that no amount of battlefield experience could prepare a man to witness. Mothers had been impaled alongside their suckling infants, the babies still clutching desperately at their mothers' breasts as death slowly claimed them both. Some victims had been impaled upside down to prolong their agony. Others showed signs of having been boiled alive before their final torment began. Birds had built nests in the eye sockets and rib cages of the decomposing corpses, creating a grotesque parody of life flourishing in the midst of absolute death. The stench was overwhelming. The sight was beyond description. Hardened Ottoman veterans who had witnessed the sack of cities and the slaughter of armies fell to their knees and vomited. Some simply turned and walked away, unable to process what their eyes were showing them. This was not warfare. This was a glimpse into the abyss of human evil, orchestrated by a man who had transformed cruelty into art. Sultan Mehmed himself, a ruler who had ordered the execution of thousands and had seen the worst that war could offer, stood transfixed before this monument to suffering. According to the chronicles, he was heard to say that no man who could conceive of such horrors should ever be deprived of his kingdom. The Sultan who had conquered an empire found himself face to face with something that transcended military strategy or political ambition. This was pure, undiluted terror made manifest. For 7 square acres, the forest of the Impaled stretched in every direction. Contemporary accounts describe the methodical precision with which it had been arranged, each stake positioned to maximize the psychological impact on approaching enemies. This was not the random brutality of a madman, but the calculated strategy of a military genius who understood that the human mind could be a more powerful weapon than any siege engine ever constructed. The Ottoman army, despite their overwhelming numerical advantage, despite their superior equipment and training, found themselves paralyzed by what they witnessed. Morale collapsed entirely. Disease continued to ravage their ranks. Supply lines remained severed by Vlad's guerrilla tactics. The mighty force that had crossed the Danube with dreams of easy conquest now faced the reality that they were trapped in a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. As news of the forest of the Impaled spread throughout the Ottoman ranks, something unprecedented happened. The greatest military machine in the world, an army that had never known defeat, began to disintegrate from within. Soldiers deserted in massive numbers. Officers questioned orders for the first time in their careers. The psychological warfare that Vlad had perfected was achieving what no conventional army could accomplish: the complete demoralization of an enemy force through pure terror. This was the moment when legend began to merge with reality, when the historical figure of Vlad Tepes started his transformation into the immortal monster known as Dracula. For here was a man who seemed to possess powers beyond human understanding, who could turn death itself into a weapon, who could make even the bravest warriors flee in terror without striking a single blow. A single blow. The Sultan, faced with this apocalyptic vision, made a decision that would echo through history. Rather than press his overwhelming advantage, rather than lay siege to a city defended by a fraction of his forces, Mehmed II ordered a full retreat. the conqueror of Constantinople, the man who had brought the Byzantine Empire to its knees, admitted defeat not to superior numbers or better tactics, but to pure, calculated terror. Vlad had achieved the impossible. With 30,000 peasants, he had turned back the greatest army the world had ever seen. But more than that, he had fundamentally changed the nature of warfare itself. He proved that in the right hands, psychological brutality could be more devastating than any weapon ever forged. The forest of the Impaled became his masterpiece, a monument to the power of fear that would haunt the Ottoman Empire for generations. This is why the legend of Dracula was born in these blood-soaked fields of Wallachia, not from some Victorian novelist's imagination, but from the very real terror of a man who understood that death was not merely an end, but a tool. A man who could make even the mightiest empire tremble before the specter of what human cruelty could achieve when guided by brilliant, merciless intelligence. The real Dracula needed no supernatural powers. He had something far more terrifying, an absolute mastery of the human capacity for fear,